because I feel like, you have to be a great storyteller to be a great history teller too. You can look up facts, you can look up figures, you can look up, dates and stuff, but, telling the kind of the story behind the story and making things come alive.
Hey guys, we're back with Mr. Haley, and this is a picture that I found from one of my friends, and it's the, the Defending Elm Springs, and actually 2 or 3 of these guys in the painting is actually from McMinnville and Rock Island. And
so when you look at a lot of glorified versions of prints and pictures that have been done in the last 40 or 50 years, Elm Springs was near Columbia. Of course, Columbia saw a lot of action during the Civil War, and so did Franklin, in and around Nashville as well. And of course, this shows a plantation house. It shows Confederate officers outside, and a Scarlett O'Hara kind of character out in the yard as well, welcoming them with greetings or food or water. And so, there have been a lot of reenactments across the South ever since the 100th anniversary in the 1960s of the Civil War. And so, those reenactments, a lot of people have uniforms. They go all across the country in reenactments. Even England has a group of Confederates that do reenactments there as well.
That's cool.
Yes, there's a couple of people from McMinnville that basically went to sitting, I guess, or sat for this picture to be made to include their images as well. And like I said, it shows a typical plantation house and officers out front, and your Scarlett O'Hara character. But we must realize that the majority of Southerners did not live like this.
No.
The majority of Southerners lived in small homes, country homes, farmhouses. And neither did they own slaves, and many of them really didn't want a war because it turned their lives upside down.
Right.
They were not able to make a living. They were not able to, transport goods, sell goods, anything else, because business came to a standstill.
Right.
And a lot of the people that glorified the war, that lived in these big houses, suffered more than anybody because there was no way to support themselves anymore.
Right. The houses probably didn't even look like this good.
Some looked even better, but
really? Okay.
But we had very few homes in McMinnville of this stature and of this grandeur, and we did have a few. But as I said, the enslavement of people to support a plantation economy really suffered greatly after the war because there was no labor. There was no way to rebuild, and many people lost their farms. And they realized that supporting the lost cause really was an end to their lifestyle and their standards of living. And for many of them, it was during the war, everything was turned upside down.
Right.
And there was, it was not even safe to stay in homes like this because marauders and renegades and both armies would, come up and, if they didn't burn the house, they would loot everything of value out of it. And if there was any food to be had, one story my great-grandmother told that my grandmother told me is they lived on a small farm in Cannon County, and so it was my great-grandmother and several small children there by themselves defending themselves.
Oh, wow.
And they had one old skinny milk cow that they hid in the woods to keep anybody from getting her, and they hid the chickens under the floor. And so a group of Union soldiers that were coming from McMinnville, going through Woodbury, going to Murfreesboro, stopped at the house and demanded that my great-grandmother feed them all. And so she never said how many there were. She said there was a yard full of them.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was just a group that split off from the main army, just looking for provisions. But they said, well, we know you've got a milk cow here somewhere because you've got little kids. And so, we're going to burn your house down if you don't feed us. So they had that. She sent one of the children out into the woods to bring the cow, and they butchered the cow. She was she had a big wash pot out in the front yards. They filled it with water, and so they cooked meat half done and fed the army, and they killed every chicken that they had underneath the floor and ate that too, and left them basically with nothing. And that's what war does, and that's what many people suffered from. And lots of regrets from supporting a cause that led to starvation and death and destruction, and people not coming back, or sons or fathers or uncles or brothers dying and laying in unmarked graves on both sides of the armies, not knowing what the end result of the war was going to be. And so like I said, the Union Army was victorious. It reunited our nation again. For most people, they put their differences aside and allowed for the former enslaved population of the country to have rights and voting privileges and to own property, to record deeds and do the thing, go to school.
Yeah.
And that was one of the first things that the local African American community did, was to start establishing churches and schools to educate their children. And W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a freedom fighter and an educator after the Civil War, and brought a lot of recognition to the rights of African Americans and former enslaved. Actually taught a little school over in DeKalb County. So, but our first little African American school was on what we call Egypt Alley. A lot of the African American community thought that was a great way to educate kids to be streamlined into the regular life of what
society.
People were supposed to be, rather than being kept from being educated and going to school. And they built churches and communities everywhere. So, plantation economy was gone, and people had to learn to adapt and adjust, or they died.
I was going to say what Mr. Haley would always tell us in school: adapt or die.
Die. And people had to. And it was hard for some, and a lot of the big farms and people that had wealth before the war ended up poverty-stricken and just as poor as anybody else did, because their source of income was gone, their property was gone, and so they had to fend for themselves and reinvent themselves, which is what a lot of people did. Most of the Confederates came back destitute, their homes gone in many cases, or family dead, and came back to nothing. And so they had to work their way back into and start all over again. And so the Union Army did occupy most of the South most of the time, but like I said, it brought law and order in places that had no law and order for many years, and it was protection. One of my relatives basically celebrated the fact that the Union Army was here because it meant stability. It meant that they probably weren't going to be killed in their sleep, and that somebody wasn't going to bust open their door and shoot them for
more
a couple of. And so it was they welcomed the Federal Army coming to McMinnville, and so not everybody did, but and James Powell Thompson, like I told you, was a Unionist who was from a very prominent family who had sons that served in the Confederacy. He flew the American flag during the entire, and he kept McMinnville from being burned on several occasions because the Union Army, wanted to get even in some cases. And but after the war, he, like I said, buried the hatchet and shook hands and and resumed his law degree and his law practice, and made his life successful even after the war, which he recommended all people to just shake hands and rebuild our lives, and that's the only future that we have. And so welcome the African American community into the general mainstream population and keep their rights and privileges the way the war was meant to ensure. So but a lot of prints were made in the 1960s for the centennial, and then for the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, there was a lot as well. So, but like I said, most people didn't to live this life of luxury, and there was very few homes of this size and grandeur in Warren County. They were just simple farmhouses, simple houses. Sometimes interesting stories come forward, even in 2024, and so Kelly brought a rifle that passed down through the family and has ended up in her possession.
Yes.
I don't see any markings on it. It might even predate the Civil War, but the story was told that it was carried into battlefield. It's in fairly poor shape. Part of the stock and support is broken. The ramrod is gone as well. But Kelly, you might want to say a little something about it.
So all that we know is that this came from our Slaughter side. Hugh Slaughter passed it down to his son Chris, and it was from the Hughes side. And so he's a descendant of that, and I don't know much more than that on it. I would like to know more about it. We'd like to clean it up and just get the history of it so we can give this puppy a life to its own. And I always just think stuff like this, you know, like you said, when y'all digged up, you might have seen these burned in the ashes, and this is still, to me, it's really neat. You can tell it's a gun, you can tell it's old, and it's like I say, I joke about this. No wonder we lost, because this sucker is heavy, and I want to put it down right now. But if anybody you know or that's watching this knows how to clean it, how to make it look right, or to figure out what the story of this gun could be, I think it'd be neat to know.
It would be. A lot of the weapons used during the war came from overseas, particularly England, Enfield rifles. You know, so when we talk about the Civil War, or the War between the states, or the War of Secession, you know, defending the rights of slavery and you know, disenfranchising people for a purpose, just to keep power was not feasible then, and it's not feasible now. So, you know, war should never be glorified, whether it's World War I, World War II, Korean War, Spanish-American War, Mexican War, Civil War, the war for Iraq. None of that. War is never to be glorified, but sometimes, you know, in order to protect our freedoms, we have to defend, you know, our allies and our people overseas, because that's how we protect ourselves. And so America has been, you know, the bastion of democracy since World War I, when we emerged as basically a superpower. And, you know, we were allowed to engage in battle against an enemy that, you know, was not conducive to democracy. And so, you know, we defend democracy, not only at home, but abroad as well. So, you know, but thank goodness that my grandmother always said, level heads will prevail.
Exactly.
And so those, we're hoping that the dissension that we have today will be put aside, and, you know, people will meet in the middle and they'll handshake. And, you know, bury any disagreements that they have, and that those level heads will prevail, and our nation will prevail for generations to come, so that we continue to be that United States of America, and we tend to be the emblem that the rest of the world looks at. And, you know, and our flag is, you know, is admired rather than despised. We want, you know, we want to be that nation that sets the benchmarks and the standards for democracies all across the world.